Welcome to Question Christianity, where tough questions get somewhat reasonable answers. Tonight, we are tackling the problem of evil and suffering. Charles is going to take us through his presentation on evil and suffering. We're going to answer your questions along the way, and we're going to have a good time, as much as you can, dealing with issues of pain and suffering. So, yeah. So I'm Caleb Johnston. With me tonight, I have here to my right
Kevin Smith.
Yep.
And down here holding us both up.
Yep. Charles Grace from Reasonable Faith.
Glad to have you both with us. So we're gonna dive right in. We've actually got a couple questions already coming in from YouTube. So we're gonna take these before we get started here with our talk about evil and suffering. So the first one is: does Matthew 10:7-8 imply that Christian books and resources should be offered for free?
Someone's gonna have to read that. Don't have it memorized.
That's a shame, Charles.
Yeah, I know, right? I pull it up. As you go, proclaim this message: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give.
Yeah, this is part of a one-time commission for the 12 on a particular mission trip. They went into hostile territory. So although it describes, it does not prescribe a general principle, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I'd be, okay, so, but I can anticipate someone saying, well, maybe it's descriptive here, but there might be a principle here that we should draw from. Is there anything else we might say? A workman deserves his wages comes to mind. I'm gonna look that up.
Yeah, Paul seemed to teach that there was a place for financial support for the work of the kingdom. I think there's probably a lot of latitude in what that may look like in different contexts. I think that we ought to make it as freely available as possible, and it's ideal when other Christians are supporting that work so that the world doesn't have to support it, but rather simply receive it as freely as possible. I think that is an ideal goal. Sure.
So this is from 1 Timothy 5, starting in 17. The elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For Scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. So I think I think if we were going to take the Matthew 10 passage rigidly like that, in other words, certainly you could give it out for free, but I think the question is, should it always be offered for free without exception? We'd have to say that then I think you'd have to say pastors couldn't get paid or shouldn't get paid, that you could never make any kind of a living out of Christian ministry. That seems a little bit too rigid and certainly not in line with, well, 1 Timothy. And I don't know, what do you guys think?
Jesus, who said this, himself had patrons, or really more commonly matrons, financially independent women who supported his itinerant traveling ministry as believers, doing the part that they could, or each part in the body does its role that it has as ordained by God, so that we work together for the advancement of the kingdom.
Yeah, there's that passage where Jesus has the perfume poured over his head, and one of the complaints that Judas said is, this could have been sold to feed a lot of poor. And then there's like a sub passage that says, but he was in charge of the money and used to take from it. So the question is, where did that money come from?
Right.
Because, I mean, Jesus had pretty much abandoned his carpentry work, I think. I don't think he was doing that on the side, but who knows? I don't know. I think it's pushing it a little bit too far.
Yeah. Again, though, I mean, I think it's ideal to be able to provide to the world as freely and as cheaply as possible. There's some ministries that do the opposite of that, which are, wolves in sheep's clothing. But then there are other ministries who bend over backwards to provide, especially digital products free. Like most of John Piper's stuff is free on his site. Most of David Platt's stuff is offered in free digital formats instead of people having to buy them. You see more of that, and I think that's good when possible.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you guys have covered that pretty thoroughly.
I'd say it's a good question. It's certainly a valid question, and if there's pushback on that, I'd be willing to entertain more dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mr. Jackson's got one more question for us here about another passage in Matthew 16:28. Okay, I'll go ahead and read that one out. In context, this is in regards to where Jesus is predicting his resurrection. But verse 28 says, I tell you the truth, there are some standing here who will not experience death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
Contextually, the most natural reading of that would be to go to the next verse, which is the start of chapter 17, in which the transfiguration, those standing there getting to see Jesus glorified, along with Elijah and Moses. It's not necessarily the only valid interpretation, but as far as the flow of the passage, that's a pretty strong one contextually.
Yeah, and I think maybe sometimes there's a confusion between the kingdom and the second coming of Christ. It may seem like those are automatically the same thing, but not necessarily, because Jesus, the kingdom is here. The kingdom is at hand. So he's coming on his kingdom, and he's preaching the kingdom. So, yeah, maybe that helps a little bit.
Yeah, I was just going to say kind of along the same lines of Kevin from the context of it. I think it's probably referring to the events that shortly followed. It seems to be what he's writing about. But
yeah, I would absolutely agree. And even if it didn't, which I'm not disagreeing, I'm saying even if it wasn't that, what we have later on through Acts is the kingdom expanding throughout the world. And I think that would certainly be a fulfillment of that, which is the Son of Man coming on his kingdom. Like, here is the Son of Man being revealed to, Judea and the rest of the world. So that is the kingdom. And of course, it won't be fully realized until the second coming, but the kingdom of Christ is here and is expanding. And one day it will be finally fully fulfilled, but not yet. Good. These are hard questions. Stop.
I know. I love it. Hey, I love it. This is the first time we've had questions before we've even went live, so that's great. Good. All right. So tonight's topic, Charles, I'm going to just
after that,
turn it over to you.
Yeah, we're going to do something super easy now that we've had those questions. Yeah, so I think we decided that we wanted to take on some more formal arguments. We did our Christian happy hour, so we're gonna talk about what's sometimes called the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. And I think that this is probably, I would say, the most important apologetic question, just because that what I've understood from statistics is this is the most common complaint or reservation or reason that people refuse or walk away from God. And so if this is the number one thing that people are having problem understanding, like how could bad things happen to good people, or how could such horrible things happen to such seemingly innocent people? And gosh, that's a real question. I don't think we should just dismiss it and say, well, we don't know, and then that's the end of it, and just have faith and hang on, brother. I think that's a real hard question, and we need to handle it. So I've certainly spent a lot of time on this PowerPoint for that reason. I wanted to have, at least in my resource, something that tries to give, I'll just say, the best answers that I could. And really none of this is mine genetically. Like, I didn't come up with this. I just tried to grab from every resource I could. I tried to think of every counterpoint and bring in other people's resources. So what we have is kind of like a hodgepodge of the individual sub questions and answers and everything. So I think the end is that it's a pretty robust PowerPoint and presentation. So this is deliberately confusing, but this is kind of the roadmap. So these are all the PowerPoint slides that we're going to end up going through. I thought that would be kind of fun. You just kind of see all these things, and as we go through, you'll be like, okay, yeah, I remember seeing that one. I remember seeing that one. And we'll take a look at this slide at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to go back and like, okay, yeah, I remember all those little points. All right, so let's talk about suffering. Why is there suffering? I don't think that there's any doubt that this world is full of suffering. One only need to take a look at the newspapers and headlines and see rape and murder. We've got wars, rumors of wars, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis, child neglect, child abuse, child abandonment, genocide, holocausts, mass slaughters, ethnic cleansings, starvation, disease, hopelessness. I can't blame anyone when they look at those things for wondering if God still exists. So maybe we should just all become atheists. I mean, those are hard things to deal with. Now, I think the first thing that is important for us to understand is that this is no new question. This question of evil and suffering isn't something that has come about just in the last 20th century or since the Enlightenment. I mean, the Greeks were dealing with this, and probably before. Well, Job is arguably one of the oldest books, if not the oldest book in the Old Testament. And so this is from Epicurus, 341 BC. You can see that down at the bottom. That's 2,300 and maybe 40 years ago, 2,300 years ago. Here we have a very robust and formal argument, the problem of evil. So it goes like this: if God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, so he wants to, but he can't, then he's not omnipotent. He doesn't have the power of God. If he's able to stop suffering, but not willing, it's like, what kind of monster? He's malevolent. Like, he could stop it, but he doesn't. Then he's just like an evil God. And if he's both able and willing, then there shouldn't be any evil. So if he wanted to stop it and he could stop it, then we shouldn't have any evil, right? He should be able to stop it so that we shouldn't see any evil, but we do have evil. So is he neither able nor willing? Then why are we even calling him God? So again, this is very old argument, and it's not a straw man argument. I think we need to embrace the full argument for what it is. I just have a more simplistic way of kind of looking at this. If those points are a little bit confusing, I just say, like, on one side of the scale, you have God is all good and God is all powerful, but it seems to get just overweighed by all the evil that we see around us, or all the suffering. So if God is good, he'd want to stop it. If he's all powerful, he'd be able to stop it, yet God exists. So he's neither not good, not all powerful, or not both, or frankly, he just doesn't exist at all. You guys have any comments or questions or clarification so far?
Oh, I like this visual.
Okay. Yeah. All right. All right. So I think if anyone's following this, then they should be kind of taken aback. I mean, maybe certainly I think everyone's experienced suffering to some point, but to see this problem put so formally can be. A matter of fact, atheists will use this argument. So, again, we're not trying to straw man anything. And to put it formally, I'm maybe even intentionally, I might have made things worse for right now. But we are going to, as I like to say, we're going to pound this argument to death. So I think we're going to absolutely destroy those premises and that argument. So now, before we try
Is that a picture of you, Charles?
I wish, yeah. That's me working in the backyard. No, I had to look for. I wanted some type of visual that says, look at, we're going to take that and we're going to just absolutely destroy it. And I really think that this presentation will do that. That these arguments are very sound, logical arguments against the problem of evil. So yeah, all right. So before we take the Christian perspective, I think it's absolutely fair to see what the atheists have to say, since they're the ones purporting this argument and saying, hey, there's so much evil in the world, then how could God exist? I think we need to say what does the atheist, or what does atheism have to say about the problem of evil? They should be able to provide their own answer. So here we have, this is a real campaign that was put on, I think, in the UK, and as it says there, hey, there's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life, right? So it's like good news, God doesn't exist. That's basically what this presentation or this campaign has to say. So sounds great when it's put on the side of a bus, but when life starts to get real, I don't think the atheist has much to say about the problem of evil, right? What answer do they have? I mean, when we look at these pictures, I pulled these off the internet. These are real pictures. Those are real children. Those are real bones. These are real catastrophes. There is absolutely real war and suffering. And I think it's actually cruel to have a bus campaign that says something like, stop worrying and enjoy your life when we have all this suffering around. What are you going to tell these kids? What are you going to tell the bones? It's hard for me to imagine a more careless and thoughtful statement than telling the suffering soul of this world to stop worrying and enjoy their life. So I think in the end, atheism has nothing to say about the problem of evil. Certainly there is suffering, but they don't have anything to say to handle it. Christianity is the last best hope for the answer to the problem of evil. So let's see what Christianity has to say about the problem of evil. Okay, so this is our roadmap. You don't have to worry about the little points here. We're going to go over each one of these individually, but I just wanted you to see the overall view. They say it's good to kind of have a general idea of where we're going. The problem of evil can be subdivided into the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional side, and on the intellectual side, then it kind of cascades into a whole bunch of different things. I would say that as we tackle these, each one of the points that we go into in itself is enough to break the problem of evil argument. And we're going to go over multiple, so it's like cascading, compounding evidence. But I just want you to keep in mind that if any one of these premises makes sense or seems to be more true than not, then the problem of evil is gone. Okay, so we have the problem of evil, and it can be divided into, as I said, the intellectual and the emotional side. And it is so important to understand the person that you're talking to, right? I mean, the problem of evil is the problem of evil, but the problem of evil as experienced by an individual can take two different views. For example, you might have someone who has just suffered the loss of a loved one, and maybe it was an unexpected and cruel and painful death. I mean, that's an emotional side, and that the way that you talk to and answer that person is going to be completely different than when you're talking to some college student who just said that they've learned about the problem of evil in their philosophy class, right? And trying to use one approach for a different person is going to have just a disastrous effect. So, for example, if you talk to someone who has just lost a loved one, and they're going basically through the emotional side of this problem, and you try to come in with like an intellectual, philosophical argument, you're going to seem callous and cruel as you try to bring like logic and reason. They're like I'm suffering right. I just don't get it. Like, I don't want to hear this logical stuff. I don't get it. Like, I'm suffering right now. And on the other hand, if you're talking to the college student or the philosophy major, and they're talking about the logical problem of evil, and you try to answer in an emotional way, they're going to think that you don't have a like a logical foot to stand on, so to speak. You're coming in for an emotional side, and it's going to seem very soft and squishy and unflattering. Any thoughts on that, or anything so far?
So
yeah, I think that's very important to distinguish that approach. Well said.
So just to summarize this in kind of a watered down version, what we're actually dealing with is multiple problems of evil, depending on where someone is coming from with their perspective. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, I hate to say this, but the truth is, guys especially like to pretend that we're all logical and no emotion, but we are emotional beings, and so we can react. The same person can react to a circumstance in two different ways, or have a mix in there. I mean, there might be, if you're experiencing suffering, there might be a logical part of you that's trying to logically like figure this out. Like, I don't understand logically how God can allow suffering, when I seem like I've done pretty good in my life and I'm a pretty good guy. I don't get it logically. The other part, like emotionally, just like, this sucks. Like, I don't get, like, where is the love of God? In reason and logic, just they don't answer the emotional, and the emotional doesn't answer the logic, and and different people are have a different mix of that depending on their given circumstances. I guess I'm saying well, a couple things. Number one, if you are someone who's gone through some suffering, especially recently, and we're going to tackle the intellectual side first. If it seems cold and callous, I just say, hang on, we're going to get to the emotional side. But on the other side, if you're someone who's kind of reading this and trying to get these points, and then you're going to go talk to someone who maybe has suffered, be very sensitive to who you're talking with, so that you give the right type of answer. Because to miss this at this, we're at the top of the scale here where things break down, and it's like a Y in the road. You take the wrong turn early, you get really lost, way down the road. So we want to make sure that we're on track. We're definitely sensitive. We have said this over and over again. You've got to talk to individuals on an individual basis. Make sure you're dealing with individual person who has individual worries, and you may talk to someone who has an emotional side of this, and then go talk to a different person who has an emotional side again, but it's still different because people are different. So, yeah. Okay, good. All right, moving on. So we are going to tackle the intellectual side first. So the logical problem of evil asserts that it is logically impossible. This is like a 1 does not equal 2 kind of thing, that it's logically impossible for both God and evil to coexist at the same time. That there's a logical inconsistency there, that the two cannot exist. Now, this puts the burden of proof on the atheist to prove that God could not ever have any morally sufficient reason for allowing suffering. I'll go into that in a little bit, but the burden does fall on the atheist to show that this contradiction is logically impossible. Note that this does not have to be a good reason. Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't have a good reason. I'm just saying, as someone who's arguing against the logical impossibility, I don't have to have a good reason to say that God has a reason to do or allow some suffering. I just have to have that it's even a possibility, because we're talking about logically impossible. That means there is no possible out. So to even have a bad possibility breaks the logical problem of evil. So if it's just a good reason or even a likely reason, it just has to be a logically possible reason. Now, I'd like us, can we do this? Can we watch a video? I think it's worth it. It's 4 minutes.
Yeah, should be no problem. If it won't play from yours, we can play it on mine. But either way, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, it's from Reasonable Faith. So there's a couple of these that Reasonable Faith has put out, and I think they're great. I think they do a great job of taking something like this logical problem of evil and putting it in comments. Well, it's gonna do a much better job than I can. So I'll try to. I bet if I play this, I'm not sure that you can hear the sound because it's coming off my computer.
If not, I can play it from mine. Which one is it?
So this is slide 18. There's a link, or I can put it. I can put it in the chat. Actually.
Yeah, I've got it. I am working on it right now. All right, let me see. All right, I found the link. Bear with me 1 second. I'll pull. I think the easiest thing to do will be to pull it up on my screen.
Yeah, good.
With sound, and then we should be good to go. So let me throw that in. All right, got it. 1 second. All right. All right, I got it. Let me just shuffle this around. Lost my StreamYard. Let me get back to you guys. All right. All right, let's see if this works.
Yay, there. Look at that.
All right, y'all can see that? Here we go.
Yeah.
We are all well aware of suffering and evil in the world. Horrific suffering. Unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil but not willing, he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that will bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
But this is hardly the end of the discussion.
Yep, that's it. So there's other videos that follow on. So if we want to watch those, or if anyone wants to watch those later on, they can. Reasonable faith. Okay, so logically impossible. Any thoughts on that? On the video? Forcing free choices?
Right. So just to boil it down, in strictly logical terms,
correct.
The argument doesn't succeed in doing what it sets out to do.
Right. Yeah. So, and I like the way you said that, the strictly logical side, or the logical part, because there is another one that's going to follow on from here. It's called the probabilistic problem of evil, and that's fine. But the Epicurean argument that we saw from 2,300 years ago has been finally, and I think logically, put down. So it does not hold. It is not valid. There is no logical impossibility for God and evil to coexist.
Right. A deductive argument like this can't establish the supposed conclusion with certainty. So it fails. So the move, as you suggested, is going to be toward an inductive or probabilistic claim.
Right. So the atheist philosophers have, as the video showed, have largely, if not fully, abandoned the logical problem of evil and moved on to something else. That doesn't mean that the common man, I mean, you know, as we've seen with many arguments and apologetic topics, it's one thing to have a good philosophical understanding, and it's another thing to get the common man on the street to, you know, engage that, to understand it, and to know that, hey, that's been like answered over and over and over again. You know, you still hear it. The Epicurean argument, as it's put, is as we said, it's very well. You know, when you read it, it's a good argument. Now, it's been shown to be fallacious, but it's still a good argument. It has impact.
It's compelling.
Yes, thank you. That's a good word. So, but for the topic tonight, we're going to move on and understand that the argument doesn't rest here. The argument is really in the next stage. All right. Now, I wanted to take a segue here before we move on to the probabilistic problem of evil. There's a common objection that's kind of in between here that the common person might ask, and that is, why did God even create evil? You know, why would he even do that? Whether or not there's a logical problem with it, like, you know, if evil exists and God created all things, then why did God create evil? You, you guys want to take a stab at that? No,
I don't want to steal your thunder.
My points here, but I'm trying not to cut you off. All right. Well, I'll start here, and then you guys can add in. So I think one of the important things to understand about evil is that evil, technically speaking, is not a thing. There's not a thing that is actually evil. And so, you know, I think anyone who hears that at first is going to be like, of course it's a thing. That's the very thing you talked about. You show all those slides. I mean, we know that evil exists. You know, we wouldn't even be talking about this if it wasn't something that was real, so to speak. But I want to make a very important distinction, in that evil is maybe it's like a shadow. So evil exists in the same way that shadow exists. Now, a shadow's real. Sure, shadows are real. I mean, you know, walk down the street, the sun's shining, you see shadows everywhere. But a shadow isn't really a thing, so to speak. A shadow in itself has no properties. There's no properties that we can tag onto a shadow. What a shadow is what we call a privation or an absence. So it's a privation of light or an absence of light, right? That said, shadows per se do have an effect, kinda, maybe. So if you're looking at if you're driving somewhere where there's snow and you look up on the mountains, you can see that one side of the mountain where the sun's hitting doesn't have as much snow, or maybe no snow, but the shadow has an effect because there's still snow there, right? The snow on the shady side of the mountain. But what's really going on there? It's not that the shadow has an effect, it's that there's an absence of an effect. It's the light that is warming the side of the hill that's melting the snow, and it's the side of the snow, that side of the mountain that isn't getting light, has an absence of the warming effect, and so the snow still persists there. Okay, let's try one more. Nothing. So the word, we throw this word out, nothing. So nothing is not a thing, right? There is nothing called nothing. There's not an actual thing that's nothing. Nothing really is no thing. So if we say that God created the heavens and the earth, is it right to say that he created nothing? No, right? Because he created something. If he created something, then it's not true that he created nothing, right? He did create something. But certainly, like, let's say that God created the earth. Okay, so he created the earth in a specific location. If that's true, that he created the earth here, but he didn't create a planet, you know, right next to it, or that he left an empty area somewhere, it's true that he might have not created something in this one specific area, but just because he didn't create in one area doesn't mean that he didn't create anything, right? If he created anything at all, then he did not create nothing. So did God make nothing? No, he didn't create nothing. He created all kinds of things. When God made Eve, right, and you can perhaps picture Eve standing naked in front of Adam, I can guarantee you that Adam wasn't thinking about all the empty space around Eve. He was looking at, he wasn't thinking, God, why did you create so much nothing around Eve? He was thinking, wow, look what you created, right? It's the thing. So all that to say that evil is a privation. It's literally impossible for did I make you blush?
Caleb has just put up a parental advisory. I just thought you want to know
that. Okay, well, I'm just, you know, I don't think I said anything out of the Bible that's not anyway, at least I didn't move into the Song of Songs. So when God made, where was I? I lost it is logically impossible, I think, for God to create evil because evil isn't something, it's the absence of something. And God is good. God does all kinds of good things. And I think he allows these privations to exist, but that is a completely different thing than creating them. So if we were really going to speak colloquially, we'd say, who really creates evil? Well, it's really us. God created us. He gave us the room or the freedom to block the light, so to speak, to create these shadows that we call evil, these privations. So if anyone needs to get targeted with the creation of evil, I'd say it's basically us. But God did not and cannot create evil. Thoughts on that?
So just as you started off, to clarify, it's not a claim that evil doesn't exist. It's a clarification of what it exists as and what it does not exist as. It does not exist as a substance or a thing, if you will, in its own right. We can say it's a property of some events or experiences, but it's a moral property of those events or experiences.
Well, we use, so I really like the metaphor of the shadow, or the simile of the shadow. So because, I mean, we use these terms like evil or shadow just because they're convenient and effective ways of communicating, right? It's very easy to say, oh, look at your shadow, like it looks really funky, or it looks like, look at the shadow over there, it looks like a crow, or we could say that. It's too difficult to say, look at the absence of light over there where there's not light, and the outline of where there isn't light, and it looks like a certain shade. That becomes difficult. So we have these names for these privations, and that's fine. Cold is a privation, right? Heat, it's a lack of heat. It's okay to say that there's cold, like it's cold in here. It's like cold. It's just awkward to say, oh, there's not as much heat in here as I'm used to, or I'd like to, we use these words, these privation words, in just common language, and they do mean things, but you can't really create cold, right? That's why refrigerators are bigger than heaters, right? Because what you really have to do is like suck all the heat out. You have to get rid of the heat. Anyway.
So can I jump in and anticipate an objection? As we're talking about evil not being a thing, so to speak, that God creates, it's not necessarily the same thing as saying that God doesn't cause events that we don't like, or that
for sure
are literally really act now after we have introduced sin into his cosmos. It's not to say that God doesn't act in punishment, wrath, or destruction. He brings what some would call evil to bear. All right. So how do we unwrap that? Is, why do we get to call what God does that's destructive not evil?
Yeah, I'm going to dive in right there before we let Charles answer that as well, because a listener brought up an objection to this that plays right into what you're saying, Kevin, and that's Isaiah 45:7, which I'll cover here briefly from the NET. It says, I am the one who forms light and creates darkness, the one who brings about peace and creates calamity. I am the Lord who accomplishes all these things.
Oh, so were you going to answer that, hopefully?
No, we're throwing all this at you, Charles.
Okay, so I think God can create calamity, and he can create destruction. But those things are not well, if God does them, they are not evil. So God can bring out his justice, and it's not all suffering is evil. Suffering is unpleasant. All suffering might be unpleasant, but it's not necessarily evil, and that might be a very difficult thing. I'm not saying all suffering is the act of God who wants us to suffer. But there is a difference that when God executes his justice, which may result in suffering, that may be a good thing. Justice is a very good thing. Now that goes off into a very large topic about God's justice, but I'll leave it at that unless you want to push back a little bit more.
Right. God, in one sense, by creating light substantially and creating a cosmos for it, then God has created the conditions for darkness, even if we define it as the absence of light. That doesn't change anything you've said. It doesn't undermine anything you, Charles, have said about darkness technically being an absence or privation of some thing. Another thing people will get tripped up on is translations in archaic language. One of our commenter friends is hung up on the King James, 400-year-old version of Old English, which renders calamity as evil, which is fine, in a very general sense, if as long as you don't equivocate on your terms. But we have to specify, evil in that, this was disastrous, or moral evil. In which you clarify, calamity, and it's deserved in the case in which God directly acts, not in all cases, obviously.
God does act, and I think he brings about his justice. And sometimes we may not understand that, which kind of goes both back and forward in our presentation. We talked about it a little bit. We'll also talk about it some more, but I think it's very important to understand if you're gonna accuse Christianity of God being evil, then you're going to have to take Christianity with all its precepts, and one of those is that God is perfectly just, so he will execute justice, and sometimes that involves suffering, and it is a good thing when God exercises his justice. It's supremely good. I think we're kind of verging on a different topic, but justice is a supremely good thing, even when we're on the sharp edge of that. And the absence of justice, is evil. So I don't think God can allow the absence of justice.
All right, further comment here. So when you say that God doesn't create evil, this is from the Truist, who's been continuing to provide some commentary as we went along. We appreciate that and the pushback. So when you say that God doesn't create evil, is it in direct contradiction to the Bible? I think we've
that looks like a statement. It is in direct contradiction to the Bible. That sounds like a statement.
And I think we've just talked about this, so I'm not sure if there's another passage that may be bothering the Truist, but particularly that Isaiah passage we've just discussed in that regard. Feel free to continue to give us any comments or any objections you may have, but I think we've kind of covered that one.
Okay, shall we move on?
I think so. Susan had a few comments here, but because of the lag, it's a little hard to catch up on some of it, and I think we've covered most of it so far. So no offense, we appreciate the comment, Susan, but there is one here. She wants to know if that's Jesus in the picture here.
That's a picture I got from the interweb. So
that really looks a lot like Mormon or Jehovah's Witness Jesus, Charles. You may want to change that picture.
I'm just going to let the picture stand as a picture only and not as an icon we're all going to bow down and worship. So It's a PowerPoint slide. That's what it is.
I'm pretty sure it's Mormon Jesus. I'm pretty
Mormon
sure.
Jesus. Is that so? That's the where's the angel? Anyway, all right, we won't digress. Moving on. Okay, so we're still on the intellectual side. So now, smart enough to see that the logical problem cannot be defended, atheists have retreated to what's called the probabilistic problem of evil. And it goes like this. Given the amount of evil in the world, it seems improbable that God would have a morally sufficient reason to do it. So we're not saying that it's logically impossible. We're just saying, gosh, it doesn't seem very likely that God would want or allow that much evil in this world if he really existed. That's a much more, it's a different thing, and it's a much more hard argument to show, because we're going to have to show that God probably does have sufficient reason to allow this much suffering and evil in the world. Any questions or qualifications on that?
One thing I'm worried about is us running out of time right when you get in the hard part.
Oh, we're gonna run out of time. There's no way. We're on slide 20 of 57. So I didn't at all anticipate we'd get all the way through this.
Yeah, I'm just trying to anticipate a good landing spot for tonight.
Maybe this is a good place to stop and address a couple more objections I've seen come in here in the questions over the course of things. That way, maybe we can touch on these, and then we can dive fully into the probabilistic problem of evil starting next time.
But I just want to say it gets really good. I mean, we really have just scratched the surface. We basically said the logical problem of evil isn't viable anymore. There is one that is somewhat viable, and we're going to give answers. Stay tuned for next time.
Yes.
Some of these answers, again, I'm not saying this because they're mine, because they aren't mine. Some of these answers are they're truly wonderful and enheartening. They're really good, solid answers. I really love that. Well, that's why I gathered them, is because I like them so much. So hang in there. And yes, we can certainly answer comments and questions.
Okay, so 2 comments that are here that are, I think, in the realm of kind of what we're touching on. So you talked some about free will just a little bit ago, and that raises the question of if we have free will here and there is evil present, if we continue to have free will in heaven. I'm trying to steelman this just a little bit here.
Sure.
But if we continue to have free will in heaven, in the next life, if you will, then how will there not be evil present there, given our continued free will?
Yep. I'm going to let Kevin answer this. He and I just had a great discussion about free will yesterday, so I'm going to dime him out. But let me give you an emotional answer to this. Again, this is not a logical answer, and I think he is asking for a logical answer, and he deserves one. But this is something I told Kevin the other day. This is going to sound really weird. I hope not. I hope I don't have a free will. I don't want my free will now. I can't tell you how many times in earnest prayer I have asked God to remove my free will. My free will gets me in trouble way too often, and I wish that God would just would take over, and I would just loyally and perfectly obey His will without any pride or just. I'm so done with my free will. Now, I don't want to second guess God. He has a good reason for doing things. I'm just telling you again. This is an emotional thing. So if I will just say, if there's not free will in heaven, amen. That sounds great. I think the answer is going to be yes, we will have free will. And so I'm going to let Kevin maybe take a stab at that one.
Okay. I am going to approach it a little differently, because I think you actually mean something different than what the way you articulated it. I think.
You can't tell me what I mean.
Okay, here's what I hope you mean. Well, how about this? Is it will, or the reality of a genuine volitional capacity that you fear, or your tainted heart, which interacts and drives your will, like my tainted heart and mine, my incomplete understanding, my blurred vision of the goodness and glory and beauty of Christ, my emaciated capacity of power of will, even when I do will something remotely good. Is it all of those unholy and incomplete and unrefined elements of all orders of my being that are the real problem, and not the fact that God has created us with intellect, emotion, and will? All of those 3 things as categories are goods in themselves, but all dimensions of those which we have violated, debased, and so on and so forth. All that to say, I'm going to say that there will be will, because there will be humanity, but there's the redeemed human, and this gets to the final question, what the real question is, what the difference is in heaven and earth. The redeemed human being is completed in the purity of their thinking, their feeling, and their willing. So it's not, God's not going to throw away any of the elements of our humanity. He is determined to redeem it, and actually for our glory. His glory is our good and completion and so forth. So it's not a game. This is, not okay, free will, then take it away, but really it's good or not. No, the redeemed are being nurtured for the fullest expression of will, which you and I have never had. We've only had pathetic versions of that to this point.
I really like the way you phrase it, which is, it's not that something's going to be taken away, but something is going to be added. That's
right. I've only tasted
Yeah.
the goodness of will. Most of what I've done with it hasn't been.
And also,
yeah.
Just a reminder, I think that's wonderful. Just a reminder, though, that right now, mankind, all of us are in a fallen state. And when we talk about free will, whatever that is, there have only been 3 people in the history of all humanity that have had true free will, and that was Adam, Eve, and Jesus Christ. The rest of us are fallen, and so we're slaves to sin, and so we do have a free will, but it's like this tainted free will that you were talking about. So
yes, it's real will, but it's not necessarily free in the full sense of that,
right,
and goodness of that word. It's absolutely genuine. We're responsible. We do make choices, decisions, and so forth. That's what volition is. But I think we flatter ourselves when we flippantly call it free. We're not quite there,
right,
in the fullest and grandest sense yet, and that's why we're not going to sin in heaven with our free will, because we've been through a purifying process. Also, God has foreknowledge, and He's simply told us what it's going to be like. And if God exists as He is, then that's the case. That we will be like that. All right.
I wonder if I can bring up a really horrible metaphor that I just thought of. So I'll risk it. This is gonna be really bad. Well, I was thinking, if you're a child and you love your parents and you do want to obey them, it's easier to disobey them when they're not in the room, so to speak, or maybe you've kind of been left alone. You still have the same free will, but when they're right there, like, oh, I don't want to disappoint my dad. He's like right there. And we will be right there. Again, this is a very poor metaphor, but I think there might be something to the fact that when we are literally in the presence of God. So we will be face to face. And I can't imagine trying to do and get away with the stuff that in my free will that I do now, when I'm literally face to face with God in the present there.
Right. Choices can be difficult due to a lack of information. Choices for me become clearer and clearer the more information I have. And if there were the right emotional and intellectual clarity on something, is it possible that someone could maintain their free will and yet still make a given choice because they have the fullness of emotional and intellectual answers to what choices result in which consequences? So I think that answers somewhat for me how things will be significantly different once this life is over. I don't know that it fully answers the question, because you still have the answer. You still have the issue of angels who have also abandoned this with some kind of additional knowledge. But I think it's certainly a step that helps me in the direction with that question anyway.
I like your answer too, because it seems to really go well with what Kevin said, which is there's going to be an adding to, not a taking away from. and that it's probably going to be both. And I think there's probably going to be some things that maybe we're not going to have the full answers to here on our little podcast on what heaven's going to be like and free will, and that may be above my pay grade.
All right. Well, I think this is as good a stopping place as any. We had some fantastic questions and listener interaction tonight. We really appreciate it from everybody watching. I wish we had time to get to a few more of these. There are some really great
Always
questions.
next time.
I'm going to write down some of these for next time. This one I liked. I wish we had time to get to. And there are a bunch more coming in here. Susan hit us with a shotgun blast of questions towards the end here. So we really do appreciate all the interaction tonight. Very thankful for everybody. As Charles mentioned, we're going to continue this discussion in 2 weeks when we come back. And we'll continue listening to you, Charles, and hitting you with these hard questions as we continue down this road. So
I want to go back and just to this right here. I mean, we barely got anywhere. We're like, so. Oh, actually, where's floating Jesus? He's not even in this. Wow, it's not even okay. Wow. So anyway, much to do.
So come back next time. Get here early. Drop your questions in chat. We'll go ahead and take some questions right off the bat next time, and we will certainly answer more of these as we go along. We appreciate it again. We appreciate you listening. We hope you found something of value here, or at least the starting of a conversation that adds value to your life. Please pass it on to somebody else who may want to also be involved in this conversation. Check us out on YouTube, Facebook, subscribe, hit notifications if
Thumbs
you enjoyed this. Yeah, all the above. So, any final words, gentlemen?
God bless.
And good night.
It's good stuff, Charles. I look forward to getting further into it with you.
Yeah, good. Thank you, guys.
Have a great night.